friends and I have always loved hiking. Every year, they chose a new route where they could take a break from the hustle and bustle of the city, build a bonfire, and discuss life under the stars. This time, we decided to choose a special place, a dense, old forest, which the locals called the Dark Forest. I've always considered such names to be just marketing for tourists, but what happened to us made me reconsider everything I've ever believed in. It happened a couple of years ago, in the middle of summer. We were ready for 4 days of complete isolation from civilization. At that moment, the news was already full of talk about the outbreak of some new virus. People started to panic, but we didn't pay attention to it. It's the usual hysteria, as always, isn't it? It seemed that the world was too big for one virus to take over so quickly. At least that's what we thought. We loaded our things into the car, took tents, provisions, flashlights, and other necessary things, and headed north. The dark forest was located quite far from populated areas, and it was difficult to get there by ordinary car. We had to leave her on the side of the road and walk 5 kilometers along a narrow path. This place immediately seemed threatening to me. Forest was old, trees were gigantic, as if they were watching us. The sun barely broke through the dense branches, and the shadows seemed alive, as if something was hiding behind each tree. In the evening, we set up camp by a small river. They built a fire, pulled out food supplies, and started chatting about everything that was happening in the world. But our fun didn't last long. About 10 o'clock in the evening, we heard a strange sound from the depths of the forest. It wasn't an ordinary sound, like a bird calling or a coyote barking. No, this sound was more hoarse, as if someone was coughing or choking. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but the sound was repeated, this time closer. Probably local animals. John, our bravest and most pragmatic friend, tried to calm everyone down. But I had a feeling it was something else. We all knew about the story that was already rolling around the country by that time, about those who caught the virus and suddenly became aggressive like animals. Of course, none of us believed in zombies, as they began to be called in the news, but the atmosphere was getting more and more alarming. We tried to continue the evening, but each of us listened intently to the silence of the night, waiting for a new sound. And this sound was not long in coming. It was a loud crackling of branches, as if someone was making their way through the dense thickets directly to our camp. John got up first, shining his flashlight in the direction of the sound. "Who's there?" He shouted into the darkness, but there was no answer. We all froze. There was complete silence all around. Even the forest froze, as if it was waiting. Then we heard the crunch of footsteps right behind us. I slowly turned my head, and what I saw horrified me. A man, or what had once been a man, was moving toward us from the dense shadows of the trees. He was incredibly thin, his clothes were torn, his skin was pale, and his eyes were crazy, sunken like a corpse's. John screamed again, but this time not just out of curiosity. The creature let out that hoarse cough and rushed at us. We reacted instinctively, as best we could. John grabbed a stick and hit him on the head, but it wasn't enough. The creature turned out to be stronger than we could have imagined. It wasn't just sick, it was inhumanly aggressive. John was a tough guy, but the creature turned out to be much stronger than we could have imagined. I watched as he struggled to keep him on the ground. His face was tense with effort, and his eyes glittered wildly in the firelight. Todd and I tried to help, but we were so shocked that we froze for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. When John finally knocked the attacker to the ground, continued to twitch and try to bite him, I grabbed the nearest stick, feeling the adrenaline rush into my blood. It seemed that we were fighting, not just with a man, but with something uncontrollable, an animal. His movements were unnatural. He didn't scream, didn't call for help, just made these creepy wheezing noises and waved his arms trying to get to us. Todd and I finally managed it when John delivered the final blow to the creature's head with a stick. It froze. For a moment, silence enveloped us. Fire crackled, the light reflected softly from the faces of my friends, but each of us was completely terrified. The creature looked like a human, but moved and behaved like an animal. "What the hell is this?" John croaked, holding onto his hand, which showed a deep bite. Blood was flowing down his arm, but he tried to stay calm. We stood surrounded by the darkness and cold of the forest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was a human being, but his aggression, his strength, and madness did not seem like something natural. Perhaps it was the virus that was being talked about so much. Panic gripped us. What if John is infected? What if we're all in danger? We need to leave, Todd said, looking back toward the trees. This one wasn't alone. Who knows how many of them are still in the forest? The panic grew with every word, but we had to stay cool. We didn't have the opportunity to leave right now. The car remained several kilometers away from us. We decided that we needed to leave the camp as soon as possible and try to get to the car. While John was bandaging his wound, we gathered the most necessary things. I noticed that his condition was getting worse. He was breathing heavily, sweat dripping from his forehead. Soon he began to rave, but assured us that everything would be fine. We couldn't waste any time. We quickly broke camp, abandoning almost all things except the most necessary one. The dark silhouettes of the trees surrounding us became menacing. It seemed that every rustle in the shadows was a signal to attack. Fear made us move faster, but with each step it became more and more obvious that John could no longer walk at full strength. "How are you?" I asked, looking at his pale face. "It's okay," he said through clenched teeth, but it was clear from his appearance that he was getting worse. The wound on his arm did not stop bleeding, and his eyes became clouded. We moved through the forest in silence, each in his own thoughts, but I knew that we had one thing in common: fear of the unknown. The virus that was taking over the country turned out to be not just another panic. It was a reality that reached us even here in this wilderness. When we were a couple of kilometers away from the camp, we heard a strange thud behind us. I looked back and noticed movement in the bushes. The leaves flew up, and something dark swept through the forest. It was moving too fast for a human. I froze, trying to figure out what it could be. "Did you see that?" Todd looked at me with wide eyes. "I'm not sure," I replied, trying to suppress my growing panic. We quickened our pace, realizing that the forest was no longer a safe place. Any delay could have cost us our lives. Time seemed to stretch out. Every meter of the way was full of tension. I didn't know how many more of these creatures were roaming around, but something told me that we weren't alone. John's condition was getting worse. He stumbled, barely able to stand on his feet. His breathing became hoarse and ragged, as if he was using his last strength not to fall. "Let's take a break," I suggested. Todd objected sharply. "You can't stop. They catch up with us, it's over. We're almost at the car." But almost didn't mean we were safe. John suddenly collapsed to the ground. His body was shaking, as if something was breaking inside him. Todd and I rushed to him, trying to figure out what was going on. His eyes were closed, but he was moaning as if in agony. "What the hell are we going to do?" Todd looked around nervously. "We can't leave him," I said, although I knew that John's chances of survival were rapidly fading. And suddenly, John stopped moving. His chest froze, and his face froze in a strange grimace. I bent down to check his pulse, but before I could touch his neck, he abruptly opened his eyes. His gaze was blank, like that of the creature we fought earlier. John opened his eyes with a suddenness that made my legs give way. His gaze was dead, indifferent, and somehow alien. I stepped back, feeling cold sweat trickle down my back. Todd was standing behind me, clearly not believing his eyes. Our friend, with whom we shared bread and laughed around the campfire just a few hours ago, was now something else. Something broke in him at the moment when he died and then came to life again. John jerked violently, as if his body had gone through some kind of convulsion. And then he jumped to his feet with superhuman speed. We both jumped back, trying to figure out what was going on. What was in front of us was no longer John. This creature, without understanding or saying a word, rushed at us with such a furious roar that I almost dropped the flashlight. "Let's run," Todd shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards the car. I couldn't resist. Panic overwhelmed me, as did Toda. We rushed through the forest, feeling the creature, once our friend rushing after us. His footsteps were fast and heavy, and every footfall on the ground echoed in my head. He was making a low, hoarse growl that was getting louder by the moment. I looked around. John, or what was left of him, was not far behind. His eyes were burning with rage. and his body was moving unnaturally fast as if he was breaking all the laws of physics. My lungs were burning, my heart was pounding in my chest, but I knew that if we stopped for even a second, we would be overtaken by what used to be our friend. Finally, we jumped out into a small clearing where our car was parked. Todd was the first to rush to the driver's door, frantically yanking it open. But my hands were shaking so much that I couldn't get the key into the lock. Panic clouded my eyes. "Come on," Todd shouted, hitting the steering wheel when I finally turned the key and the car started. Before I could step on the gas pedal, John crashed into the passenger door window. His hands, bloody and disfigured, frantically tried to break the glass. "Punch it!" Todd literally roared as the windshield cracked from his impact. The car screeched off, and John rolled down the hood like a doll thrown to the ground. Todd and I froze in shock for a second, but we continued to race along the forest road without looking back. We rode in silence until the darkness of the forest was far behind us. It was only when we were on the highway that I was finally able to speak. "It wasn't John," I said, looking straight ahead at the road. "It was someone, something else." Todd sat staring in front of him with a blank expression on his face. His hands were still shaking, and there was horror in his eyes. "We should have left him," he finally managed to say. "We should have left him there in the woods." I didn't know what to say. No matter what we do, John can't be brought back. What was left of him was now a threat that we could barely escape from. I could still hear his footsteps behind me, his heavy breathing growling in the night. But the worst was yet to come. When we got to the nearest town, the atmosphere there was no less tense. The city seemed calm, but it was deceptive. Everywhere we looked, people froze in fear. The streets were deserted, and only a few cars were passing by at breakneck speed, clearly in an attempt to escape. Todd and I parked the car at some old gas station, and I immediately noticed something strange. In the distance, two people were standing at an intersection. They were motionless, as if they were waiting for something. We couldn't see their faces, but I felt goosebumps running down my skin. These were not ordinary passers-by. Their clothes were torn, and their movements, when they suddenly began to move towards us, were sharp and jerky. "No, not that," Todd whispered. I realized that they were infected too. The same empty eyes, the same inhuman jerks. They rushed towards us, and I felt the panic begin to take hold of me again. The virus has already reached this place. We weren't safe. We hurriedly jumped back into the car and took off. My heart was pounding wildly, and my thoughts were spinning chaotically. What to do? Where to go? There seemed to be no way out. The virus spread to more and more people, and they all turned into these creatures, insensitive, aggressive, devoid of humanity. After driving a few kilometers, we decided to stay at one of the roadside motels, which at first glance looked deserted. Everything was quiet inside, but this only increased the anxiety. We locked ourselves in the room, trying not to make noise and not attract attention. The night passed in heavy silence. Todd fell asleep for a few hours, but I couldn't close my eyes. Every rustle outside the window, every knock on the wall made me jump on the spot. There was only one question in my head. How many more people like John are wandering these roads? And is there even a safe place? The next morning, as we were leaving the motel, I saw them. Two infected stood in the distance, their bodies shaking as if they were struggling with something inside themselves. But it wasn't a fight, it was an expectation. And when they saw us, they rushed forward like hungry animals scenting prey. We were racing down the road again, trying to escape. Now I knew it was impossible to escape. The virus is already everywhere. It was only the beginning of the end. The road ahead seemed endless, but we couldn't stop. I didn't know how much time we had left, but one thing was clear. Every day, every night could be the last. We drove in silence, as if we had left all our emotions and strength behind in the forest where we lost John. The world around us was no longer safe. Every passerby, every sound, every turn of the road seemed like a potential threat. We didn't trust anyone anymore. The infected could be anywhere, hidden under the masks of ordinary people, until the virus begins its destructive effect. The silence in the car seemed louder than anything I've ever heard. Todd was lost in thought, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, and his eyes remained fixed on the road. His face was grim, his lips pressed into a thin line. I understood that he was going through the loss of John as much as I was, but we didn't have time to grieve. Our lives were hanging by a thread. Soon the road led us to a small town. It looked abandoned. The houses stood close to each other. Most of the windows were broken or boarded up. There was not a single person on the street, although in some places you could see signs of a stampede. Abandoned cars, broken shop windows, hastily closed doors. It was a ghost town. Maybe we can find food or gasoline, I suggested, pointing to a small gas station ahead. Todd froze for a second, then nodded slowly. We stopped the car nearby and got out, trying not to make unnecessary noises. The air was thick, filled with a strange, musty smell, the smell of death and decay. As we got closer, I noticed blood on the sidewalk, stretching towards one of the houses. A feeling of anxiety crept into my heart. "Be ready," I whispered, gripping the tire iron I'd taken from the car tightly in my hand. We stepped inside an abandoned building. Inside, everything was overturned. Shelves lay on the floor, empty cans, boxes, and bags were scattered everywhere. Apparently, this store has already been looted. But maybe we'll still find something that can help. While I was rummaging through the remnants of the goods, Todd went into the next room. After a couple of minutes, I heard his muffled voice. "Dude, come here." His tone was so strange that I instantly tensed up and hurried to him. When I entered the room, my heart began to beat faster. There was a woman lying on the floor in front of us. Her body was twisted, as if she was trying to escape, but did not have time. She was dead, it was clear. But the scariest thing was that her eyes were open. Their blank gaze was fixed on the ceiling. "We have to leave," I gasped, feeling my stomach clench with horror. But before we could take a step, a loud metallic knock came from the street. We froze, listening. Something was outside. My breathing quickened, and I felt sweat trickle down my neck in cold drops. "They're here," Todd whispered. A low growl, barely audible, reached us. I rushed to the window, looked out and saw them. Infected. 3, no 4. They moved slowly but decisively, searching all around for something or someone. Their movements were unnatural, with sharp jerks, as if every movement was difficult. It was an eerie sight. They didn't scream, they didn't call for help, they just walked forward, driven by a single purpose. "We need to leave," I said, trying to suppress my panic. "Otherwise they'll find us." Todd nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the dead woman on the floor. Her empty eyes seemed even scarier now that death was standing outside the door. We quietly left the building and, trying to stay away from the eyes of the infected, moved back to the car. But as soon as we got to it, I heard a crash. One of the infected turned his head in our direction. His eyes, as empty as John's, froze on us, and then he slowly but confidently walked towards us. The others followed him. Their footsteps quickened as they sensed our proximity. "Get in the car," Todd shouted. We rushed to the car, barely managing to get inside. Todd started the engine and we took off. In the rearview mirror, I saw the infected rushing after us, their bodies twisting strangely in motion, but they did not lag behind. These creatures were faster than expected. We still escaped. "We can't live like this," Todd said after a few minutes of silence, his voice trembling with fatigue and tension. "We can't run away forever." I knew he was right. We are saved now. How many more such meetings will we survive? This virus has already spread all around, and there were no signs that it would ever end. We were like hunted animals, running from predators that could not be stopped. But did we have another solution? Every city, every forest was dangerous now. The infected knew neither pain nor fatigue. They just walked until they found new victims. We were next.